All right, so good morning. It's actually really my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jenna, for inviting me to moderate this debate between Annie Lowrey and Oren. The topic before us is, should the U.S. government use universal basic income to promote human flourishing? This is a fun and important topic to think about. It's in some sense both very timely and timeless. Timely because I think the U.S. is at this historical moment of significant political and economic restlessness and grappling with the consequences of being in a globally integrated economy with mobile labor and capital, as well as rapid technological change, are sort of putting pressures on our existing social and economic structures. And a universal basic income is viewed by its proponents as one way of responding to, I think, some of this disruption. Timely also because we have some experiments going on in the real world. So Stockton, California, this year is experimenting with a universal basic income of $500 per month for 12 to 18 months is, I think it's a range. And I guess it was announced just yesterday that Chicago has formed a task force to explore the possibility of adopting, at least on a pilot basis, a universal basic income. But the topic also raises timeless questions about the fair allocation of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation, about the trade-off between efficiency and equity, and what we owe each other. So I commend FedSoc for putting this together and Jana for bringing in these two really wonderful advocates for their positions. So we have at the end Oren, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He works on issues such as the social safety net, environmental regulation, trade, immigration, education, and organized labor. He's published in many prominent outlets, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and National Review. He also frequently speaks to student groups and testifies before Congress, and he has a forthcoming book, which you should all check out, The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America. He earned a BA in Political Economy from Williams College and a JD from Harvard Law School. And has been here before as a participant in the softball tournament. You can pause for that. Here. Annie Lowrey is the author of Give People Money, How a Universal Basic Income Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World. And you should all check that out. She's a contributing editor at The Atlantic, covering economic policy, but you'll find a lot of her writing in the New York Times, where she previously covered economic policy. She studied English and American literature at Harvard University and wrote for the Harvard Crimson. So as Jana mentioned, I'm going to give 10 minutes to each of our speakers. 30 minutes I'll facilitate sort of a pointed back and forth, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Annie, if you don't mind, go first, and I'll keep track of time.
Sounds great. So thank you to all of you for being here, for Wings, also to talk about social policy, to the beloved professor, to Andrew, to Jana, to FedSoc, and to UVA for hosting us, as well as to Oren for debating this. And I apologize for I forgot to print my notes, so I'm going to have to look at my phone. So we're here at a good moment in the economy, which at a lot of points in the last decade we wouldn't have said that. The unemployment rate is 3.9%, which is quite low. The economy is growing at a pretty good per annum pace. The share of Americans living in poverty continues to decline. Median incomes are rising for most people. Nevertheless, the middle class is shrinking, and its earnings are largely stagnant. There's been basically no movement in the real median hourly wages of American workers in something like the past 30 to 40 years. 2.4 million American workers who worked full-time all year were still in poverty. 13 million children in poverty in a given year. Income inequality continues to distort the growth picture, since that the averages don't really tell you much about what's happening at the bottom. Stuff is cheaper, much cheaper. Things like cars, televisions, iPhones, but things like rent in major metro areas, healthcare, elder care, and child care, and education. The growth in the cost of those continues to make them unaffordable, even for middle-class, upper-middle-class families. The economy is stratifying on all sorts of different lines, politically, right? In terms of health, so lower-income people are actually, in some cases, seeing shorter life expectancies, whereas higher-income people are living longer. Mobility is low in the United States compared to our peer countries. And so UBI, perhaps it's worthwhile to just say what we're talking about, which would basically mean the government giving everybody a cash payment, probably something like $500 a month. So enough to really make a difference in people's lives, but not enough to reduce the incentive to work too much. A related idea is something called a guaranteed income. So basically, government knows how much you make. If you make less than a certain amount, they'll boost you up to that amount, so you can eliminate poverty pretty quickly through that. And so why would we do that? There's a lot of arguments for it, but I want to focus on three big ones. So one is wage stagnation and the kind of growth of an American precariat, the way in which the middle class just feels very, very fragile. We have a declining labor share of income. Increasingly, employment is kind of tenuous for people. You're starting to see people do work in more contingent work arrangements. There's been this sort of like triumph of capital over labor. And so UBI would kind of act as sort of a strike fund for workers. If you have $500 or $1,000 a month coming in, you're going to be able to say no to an employer who's offering you a job that is degrading, is dangerous, is not remunerative enough. And so in a world in which I don't expect that we're all going to join labor unions imminently, this could really help boost the incomes of middle-income Americans and to help improve the labor market. Ending poverty. This is a big one. We have a very effective safety net in some ways. We have lots of big transfer programs that boost the wages of people in the lower 60% of the income stratification. And so programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit are really important. Programs like Social Security are really, really important. But nevertheless, there are lots and lots of people who fall through holes in the safety net, which is why our child poverty rate is something like 3 to 4 times as high as it is in countries that are equivalently wealthy. It's because we choose that, right? Increasingly, our anti-poverty programs are contingent on work, and so we penalize people who are not working or making work effort. And that means if, because you're in a rural area, because you have a language or literacy challenge, because of just, basically bad luck, you're more and more shut out from them. And I think it's worth noting that poverty is not just a sad thing. It has costs. So child poverty alone costs the US economy something like $700 billion a year, every year. Because kids who grow up poor have less educational attainment, they are less healthy, and they have lower earnings trajectories than their peers who just make it over the poverty line. The third thing is that this would reduce stigma and injustice in the current safety net system, right? Again, we have a safety net designed with holes in it. A lot of the programs were initially structured to exclude people of color. So perhaps most famously, Social Security initially does not cover domestic workers and agricultural workers who are predominantly non-white folks. A lot of the programs that we have that support not middle-class Americans or upper-income Americans, but low-income Americans have very different and difficult application requirements. So if you're getting something like a home mortgage interest deduction, right, it tends to be pretty automatic. All you have to do is show that you own a home and have a mortgage, you qualify, right? Whereas if you're applying for cash welfare, so TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, you have to meet with a social worker. You have to pass a drug test. You have to pass an asset test. In many cases, you have to abide with a work requirement that might require you to, for instance, go to your college professor and ask them to sign you in to show that you've been going to class. It's degrading, and it leads people to drop out of these programs. Again, this is part of the reason that we don't do a lot of help for people at the bottom, or don't do as much help for people at the bottom as we would like to. So there's a lot of arguments for why not to do this, which I think Oren will touch on, but one is that it's expensive. This is just true. However, the U.S. taxes and spends something like 25% of its GDP every year. A lot of our peer countries, so for instance, France or Denmark, something more like 40, even 50%. So there's tax money out there to do this. Second thing is that it would reduce the incentive to work. I think UBI boosters do not grapple with this. It is true that that would happen. If you give people money, there's less incentive to work. However, there are also studies showing that the people who tend to reduce work effort tend to be the parents of young children, people nearing retirement age, students who stay in school for longer, and unemployed people who take longer to match with jobs. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The third is that it's not naturally progressive, right? We're not naturally giving more help to people who need more help. That's a policy challenge, but it's not an impossible one to overcome. I think a more regressive system than what we have right now would probably not fit, given the challenges that we're facing and the inequality that we have. I'd also just like to note, even leaving aside the case for a big UBI, within it, it contains a lot of principles that we could easily apply to existing programs. Instead of providing in-kind benefits, we could provide cash. We could make programs easier to apply for and to use. We could make them more universal. So means testing could be automatic and done through the tax code as opposed to through a kind of complicated application process. We could aim programs at people who need them more, children, right? People talk about a universal child benefit as being a good option here. We could also start with things like guaranteeing income. To get every American above the poverty line would cost the government something like $200 billion a year. It's a lot of money, it's not that much money. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Oren, who will make a case against the case against.
Compelling
Case against. I'm looking forward to being persuaded.
All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks you guys all for coming. I gather this might be like the last day you don't get at least an inch of rain for a while. So wonderful to see so many of you here. Unlike Annie, I have my notes in an official leather-bound fence. So on that basis alone, I hope you'll consider.
I've already lost.
I hope you'll consider the merits of our cases. You know, I want to talk about basic income in two ways. One, sort of a standard economic policy discussion, and one that's a much more social or cultural question about how we want our society to operate. So I'll start with the economic side and why it just will not work to do a basic income. But a little bit in the alternative, I would say, even if you could do one, we shouldn't want to do one. So we'll kind of cover those two sides. I think in terms of the actual economic case for a basic income, the place to start is with what someone, I can't remember his name at the moment, is called the impossible trinity of the basic income, which is that there are three things you might want it to do. You might want it to be something we could actually afford. You might want it to be universal, meaning that you give it to everybody, and you might want it to be actually big enough to meet someone's basic needs. You can choose two of those three. You can't have all three. And I hope this won't sound overly harsh, but in Annie's discussion, you might have noticed a lot of sort of bouncing between different descriptions of the plan. Maybe it's for everyone, maybe it's only for poor people, maybe it's $500 a month, maybe it's $1,000 a month. These details actually matter a lot. If you actually want it to be enough to claim that you are lifting everybody out of poverty, you're talking about spending a tremendous amount of money. If you want it to be something that you give to everybody, now you're talking trillions and trillions of dollars a year. If you want a guaranteed income instead of a basic income, which I think, or a universal income, which is a good distinction, you run into an even sharper problem, which is that you tell everyone you're going to give them the money even if they don't work, and then you have to start taking it away from them as soon as they earn money of their own. And so if you commit to giving everybody at least enough to lift them out of poverty, and the reality is that entry-level full-time jobs in a lot of cases aren't a lot better than that, you create a really serious incentive problem. If you just say everyone gets it no matter how much they earn, you avoid that. I think that's one of the best cases for a genuine universal income, but now you're truly talking about trillions and trillions of dollars a year. So I think it's important to recognize that when you actually get into, okay, what is the actual proposal and how would it work, it's very hard to craft one that actually is both fiscally feasible and delivers the benefits that a lot of proponents are claiming for it. The second thing I would say about it is that even if you could craft some sort of combination that you think starts to get to some of these goals, it's probably not actually the right way to do it. And I think that's one of the big problems with a lot of arguments for the basic income is they compare basic income to nothing. Well, if you tell me I have another $2 trillion a year to spend on public policy, I have some other things I'd like to discuss before just mailing everybody a check. And in fact, for a lot less than $2 trillion a year, we could discuss a lot of those things. So, you know, if you run through the rationales that Annie had, I think they're very important ones for us to talk about. So wage stagnation is a great example. I think we should do something about wage stagnation, but I would much rather do something that actually ties it to people working. So a good example of this would be a wage subsidy. If you are working and earning a wage, but it is low, we could top that up. We can put more money in your paycheck. That avoids a lot of the problems I just described. It actually incentivizes work, and it's much, much, much cheaper. If we want to end poverty and recognize that our existing safety net has some serious holes in it, I think I'm all for that. I think we should recognize that just mailing everybody a check per se doesn't end poverty. We would be right back here having this conversation about all of the people facing very serious hardship. And the best example of that is that we have a program called disability, right? If you qualify for a disability, you get roughly what a basic income would be. And we describe that class of people as one of the most severely disadvantaged group needing help. We don't give that a check mark as a group that social policy is really working for. So I think we need to identify holes in the safety net, figure out who it's not working for, talk about how to make it better. But again, we can do that without discouraging work and without spending $2 trillion a year. And then finally, and this will now drift into the social discussion, stigma is not necessarily a bad thing. There are reasons you want stigma in society, and they're because a lot of the reasons that people do things are for social rather than economic reasons. And so when you start to talk about a basic income, I think it's really important to recognize that it is the most radical social engineering policy we have ever contemplated in this country. It fundamentally redefines the relationship between people and the state, what people's obligations are to themselves and their families. And it essentially says, first of all, it is now the state's obligation to provide for you, not yours to provide for you and your family. And therefore, to the extent that you're working because you want to earn more money, maybe, but work isn't actually the mechanism by which you are going to provide for your family. And so far above what we're talking about with respect to the economic implications and the incentives for work, we have to think about what work actually means for people and the incredible degree to which work actually is what gives meaning and purpose to people's lives, providing for their families, and the extent to which that is contingent on the work being the thing that provides for the family. If you say the reason you're working is not to provide for your family, you've just exploded an enormous part of the case for work. And so I think part of the benefit of the more stigma-based system we have is to say, absolutely, we're going to put a floor under everybody. No one's going to starve in the street if we're doing things well. No one's going to have no access to medical care and so forth. But it's not supposed to be a full substitute for what you can get if you actually work. It should be a little bit harder. It should be not as good. And we want to recognize in both social and economic terms that people who work and provide for themselves and their families are doing more. And so the last thing I would say, and as you get into the more social discussion, it gets a little bit harder to figure out, okay, but how would we evaluate this, right? How would we do an experiment to test this one way or another? And what I always encourage people to think about in the social or cultural terms is that we already know what people think about basic income because we don't do it for our own families, right? Everyone in this room under the basic income model would be paying so much more in taxes to support less well-off people that for much less you could create a basic income for your own kid. You could easily put enough money aside and tell your kid every year, by the time they're 8 or 10, don't worry, the day you turn 18, you start getting automatic payments. I hope you do something good with your life, but if you just want to backpack around Europe and smoke pot in the basement, you still get the payment. There's nothing I can do about it. We don't do that. We consider, maybe some people do, but for the most part we don't. We would say that's a really horrible message to send and way to raise a family. And to the extent that such trust fundism does exist, we don't look upon it very well. A basic income is a guaranteed trust fund for every kid that you can't do anything about, even if you don't want your kid to have it. Uncle Sam set it up, and the day he turns 18, he gets it, and he knows that, and all his friends know it, and there's nothing you can do about it. So unless we socially are ready to think that that is the right way to raise people in the country, I would say it's not a policy that we should.
Okay, so I like the way you sort of bifurcated the discussion into sort of the economic questions and these sort of fundamental cultural issues. So I think I'd like to maybe focus focus our discussion first on the economic ones, then we'll turn to cultural ones, because they're both very interesting. Annie, I guess, could you respond first to Oren's observation that the UBI may not be best tailored to address some of the social ills you mentioned? Because that crossed my mind as well. You were talking about the shrinking middle class, stagnating wages. It wasn't clear to me that a UBI of even $1,000 a year would help address some of those issues. Can you talk, I guess, about some of the benefits that you think are most important to flow from UBI, and whether UBI would help address any of those other issues?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing that I think is really important to flag is that when people talk about a basic income, the idea is that it's not so much money that it would reduce the incentive to work too much. We actually have a lot of evidence on this, both from studies that were performed in the United States between the 60s and the 80s, the same kind of famous sign dime studies that were done mostly by the Nixon administration, and in this kind of curious historical wrinkle, two of the people who helped run them were Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. And so, again, they showed that, yeah, there's a reduction in work effort. But even with like a $500 or $1,000 a month payment, we don't expect that actually people would just be kind of sitting around. And, you could probably actually gear the payment in a way that you didn't encourage people to do that so much. On the other hand, we also know that there's an amount of money that you could give people that they would stop working. So one of the ways that we know this, besides the fact that it's just pretty intuitive, is that there are some Native American tribes that take their casino revenues and redistribute them to members. The tribes that do a small amount of this tend to have employment rates that look like local employment rates. There are a few tribes that are so wealthy that they distribute something like $5,000 or $10,000 a month to members. Nobody works, right? This makes perfect sense. So I just don't know that with $500 or $1,000 a month, you're going to create such a disincentive for people to stop working, especially given that we do have a culture that valorizes work, right? Even very low income people who are very marginally attached to the labor force want to work, and they often just face barriers that they can't. They get fired, they can't actually get there, they can't find somebody to watch their kids. So I feel like that's kind of more of the issue. And so I push back on this idea that a UBI of $500 a month is going to blow our entire economy, the basis of our economy, and its devotion to work up. I don't quite see it. There's an idea in the UBI space, which is really wonderful, called fully automated luxury communism. So this is the idea that the robots will get so good, the AI will get so good that there'll just be less demand for human labor. We'll all kind of have sort of Star Trek type jobs, like exploring space and whatever. That sounds great. It's like a real flight of fancy. I look forward to 100 years from now joining everybody here in the singularity when luxury communism is a thing, but I don't know that it's what we're talking about right now. As to the kind of middle class argument, so say that you're making not a lot of money, right? Maybe you end up going and being a public defender and you're making $40,000 a year in I have no idea if that's an accurate salary, but let's pretend it is, in a pretty high cost of living place, right? What that $500 is doing for you, as opposed to something like the earned income tax credit or some of the other tax credits that are going to come to you, is that because it's something that you're getting regardless of whether you're working or not, you can use it to basically demand better conditions from your employers. We don't have anything like this. Right now, all of our system of supports for middle class workers is actually contingent on the work, or most of it is, because you don't get the EITC unless you're working. The other thing about the earned income tax credit and other incentives to keep people working is that they are not neutral on what work is. They're not expansive on what work is. Taking care of a kid is not work, right? It is labor, but in terms of the EITC, it's not work. And so if we're moving into an economy where there's going to be more service work, if we're moving into an economy where child care and elder care, the lack of options for that is a crisis, I don't think it's crazy to start thinking about ways that we can think of unpaid labor, household production as becoming more important part of the economy. And I do agree with Oren that it's one of the kind of mind-bending qualities of UBI is that it really makes you question what work is. So I think that question.
Yeah, Oren, I wanted to ask you to to revisit this trilemma, I think you described it. So a UBI can't both be, you said, affordable, available to or given to everybody equally, and then the third prong was
Large enough to
large enough to actually matter. So that's probably right, and we encounter dilemmas and trilemmas in other contexts, and usually the answer is, well, you kind of strike a middle path. Okay? And some of what I hear Annie saying is that no, it might not, have all of these desired effects, but it would be an improvement. I guess two questions: why is that not enough? And a related question is, to the extent there are some of these adverse, say, work incentive effects, why can't those be dealt with through other policy interventions, so that the combination of a UBI and, say, a reduced tax rate for low-income workers, or some adjustment can be made elsewhere in the system to compensate? Why wouldn't that work?
Well, so I want to start by picking up on something that Annie said that will help address this question as well, which is, when I talk about work disincentives, let's say, I'm not suggesting that anybody in this room is going to stop working because of UBI, but no one in this room is the reason we're talking about UBI in the first place. I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about, in all of this, the marginal population. And let's say, for instance, as a quintessential example, like young minority males who right now are having a really hard time connecting to the productive labor force as they age out of high school, whether they graduate or not. That's the sort of quintessential group that's generating all of these poverty statistics, that's seeing the stagnating wages, and that we supposedly want to help. I shouldn't say supposedly, that we do want to help. And that's exactly the group where you would expect to start to see these incentives, even when you're talking about $500 or $1,000 a month. So I think it's important to stay focused on that. When we then talk about something like the trilemma, you're exactly right. Therefore, what you have to do is guide some middle path. The problem is that when you do that, you lose the benefits. That the benefits are being asserted on the basis of being able to do all of these things, and they disappear very quickly when you don't. So, for instance, on the universal dimension, as soon as you start to abandon universal, the public interest defender isn't going to get the UBI if we abandon the universal component. Now, that might be fine, but then we can't talk about UBI as addressing that case. More generally, when we start talking about especially low-income folks, if you abandon the universal dimension, you start to get much more serious work incentive problems, because you're essentially taxing away a very large share of their earnings in the form of reduced basic income payments. You get a similar problem on the how generous it is component. So, maybe you say, well, any money is better than no money. But one of the key questions in a lot of the basic income debate is what happens to the existing safety net. If we're trying to do this, we already spend more than $1 trillion a year on means-tested programs. So if we're trying to do this in place of at least some of that, and this is one of the reasons people on the left, in some instances, get very uncomfortable with basic income, is people on the right will say, okay, great, so what do we get? So what are you getting rid of then? And either the answer is, well, nothing. The basic income isn't actually enough to live on. Especially let's talk about healthcare, right? Not even the $1,000 a month is going to get you much healthcare unless we also keep all of Medicaid and all of Obamacare. Well, so now that's another, almost, $750 billion, give or take. Do we still need food stamps? Do we still need housing, et cetera? So on that dimension, if you're not actually going to make the UBI enough to live on, well, now you still need the whole safety net next to it. And so you don't get any of the simplification benefits or savings that you might talk about. And then I always forget one of the dimensions of the trilemma also. Universal, big enough, and affordable. Yeah, that's right. And so, we could just take over, at some point we say, yeah, well, why don't we just redistribute roughly half the economy in this manner? And then you have two problems. First of all, you actually, at some point, I'm not a supply sider by any means, but at some point you have to recognize that you're talking about taking the majority of all income from high-income earners, plus a very large share of middle-class income, and you have to start worrying about things like the size of the economy that's actually going to support the program in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is an important part of the discussion, like notwithstanding maybe the cultural signal sent to people just receiving money, more money is better. It'd be great if just everybody had more money, and on that, I'm sure everybody would be better off, but that's gotta come from somewhere. And so, if you have, and it's really important, as Oren was suggesting, the incentive effects created by generating an additional $4 trillion of revenue would be, we can't even imagine what that new equilibrium would look like. It's so radical.
Denmark. It's not so radical.
I think one of the challenges, though, with both these pilot studies that happen at the level of a native reservation, or even at the level of the city of Chicago, or even of Denmark, is that it's a big leap to understand, imagine how an economy as large as the United States would adjust. So I think we'd be taking a leap of faith.
Yeah.
Can I throw one thing on Denmark also, just because I'm curious how you address that as well? Denmark is at that rate without the basic income.
Yeah.
In other words, they can tax at those rates because they then provide the middle class with free college, free healthcare, free everything else. And so that's just the other piece I worry about, is if we decide we're dedicating all this to basic income, we're Denmark without actually all the things Denmark's spending today.
So that'll be my question: is do you have sort of any more thoughts about where the money would come from?
So, I mean, first of all, I want to push back a little bit on this idea that you have this impossible to solve policy dilemma, right? And I think that sometimes people require sort of like the perfect as opposed to the good out of UBI. So more marginal policies are going to be more bang for the buck. Like, that is straightforwardly true, right? Like, UBI is kind of a big, wasteful, everybody gets $1,000. Like, I don't disagree with that at all, actually. But I think guaranteeing a minimum income, which is a much easier policy design, we use something called negative income taxes, we know how to do this, you would eliminate poverty, you could also provide a bigger wage subsidy to people whether they were working or not. It's just not that expensive, right? So I feel like universality is actually the first thing that I'm willing to give up. Just in the sense that, like, yeah, we're not worried about people who are making more than $70,000 a year, right? Like, that's just true, right? Like, maybe we want a more progressive system. As to how much space we have to tax and to spend, like, this is a political economy question because the money is out there. So first of all, I don't think that you would want to do this through the income tax system for precisely the reason that Oren highlights. You could tax away every dollar that everybody in the 1% makes, and you wouldn't come close to covering a big new social program. That's just true. There isn't enough money there. But people often talk about instead moving to things like a VAT, right, which is probably a better tax system anyway, or moving to things like financial transactions taxes, taxes on carbon and pollutants, taxes that might have some greater social benefits, so taxes on things like sugar, vice taxes, that sort of stuff. And there's just, there's money there, right? So I don't see it as totally impossible. As to kind of the third part of the dilemma, which is like, are you giving people enough to get them up above the poverty line to make it a meaningful amount? For the very poorest people, very small amounts of money are still very socially protective. So there's these really interesting studies that show, like, how much money do you need to have in order to make an income shock, right, so the loss of a job or a sudden bill or something more manageable, and to avoid the kind of like downstream, then you end up with payday loans, then you get your internet turned off, then you can't use your car, so you're taking the bus, like that kind of stuff. It's tiny. It's like $300 or $400. Makes a huge difference. And so I don't look down on this idea of like even providing relatively small payments to families. And I think that Oren is right that like there's a certain slipperiness then, right? Because they're like, well, what are we talking about if we're not talking about UBI? But policy design is just really complicated. And I agree that like, I don't defend UBI on the grounds that it's like the most effective policy that we could imminently put in place. But I do think that the idea of providing cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers, is a really powerful one. It's about 130 countries across the world that do conditional or unconditional cash transfers. The United States does have them. It's just that our programs are much smaller unless you're talking about Social Security, which is obviously very big. So yeah, apologies that that's kind of like a wiggly a wiggly answer, but I agree that, like the question, and it's actually something that I think UBI advocates need to ask themselves, is like, what policy problem are you trying to solve? Because you're not going to solve all of them, and there are absolutely trade-offs. Yeah.
So I'd like to turn now to some of these cultural questions that Oren raised. And one of the things you said kind of struck me that this is the most radical social engineering proposal ever contemplated by man in the history of the galaxy. So in the United States.
It's got to be slavery, Oren, right?
So that I did wonder about that, and one of the things we talked about earlier is the way that sort of details of implementation and descriptions matter to people, because we live in, even if you imagine like a night watchman state. Maybe we're providing police services, a court system to adjudicate contracts, and fire services, and a military.
You
right?
can privatize fire services.
You can, but we don't, right? And you imagine an income tax instead of just a flat income tax, a flat rate. There's redistribution built in there at that level. Everybody benefits from police, fire, courts, military, regardless of whether they work or not. So they receive in-kind benefits that are not attached to their income or whether they work or not. Mm-hmm. And so this is, this is cash instead of in kind. What else is different about it that makes it the most radical idea?
Well, so if we're talking about the full UBI, it's like the full Monty. If we're talking about a genuine kind of, let's take taxes up to 50% of the economy, give everyone in the country enough to live on, which I would, $1,000 a month, let's say. Which, remember, means if you're a family of four, that's $48,000. So kind of let's make median income the baseline almost. If we're talking about that, then we are shifting from a world that says we are a society that not only has those in-kind services, but is also already committed to putting much more substantive floors below people. I mean, emergency room has to treat you. You have this giant safety net. But we are converting, none of those things, I think, have taken away the social and cultural concept that work is the means by which people provide for themselves and their family, and that is your obligation as a member of society to do. No one's going to say, well, I don't have to bring in enough money because I've already got a military. Would someone say I don't have to bring in enough money because I can get food stamps, a housing voucher, whatever? There's some debate about whether in the most impoverished communities you get some of that effect. But the reality is that at least, and I think we could do a better job with this, but you can certainly see the upside both immediately and in the long run of taking that first low-wage job. The reality is, for a significant share of the population, that $48,000 a year lower middle class is the best they can ever hope to do in the labor market. And that is something that we hold out as an aspirational goal that you work very hard to achieve. And that for people who do achieve is what gives a lot of meaning and purpose to their life. I mean, I think one way that we misunderstand the idea of meaningful work is to evaluate its meaning in kind of the Steve Jobs commencement address sense, right? Of whether or not like you're saving the world. And that's fine if you want to go save the world. That's not how most people think about work. Work is meaningful, first of all, because you're providing a useful service to others. You are contributing something productively to the world. And because it is the means by which you support yourself and your family. You're fulfilling your own obligations. And so unlike any of those other things you were talking about, in fact, the stated premise of the basic income is to take that away and say, and it's a little unfair to tag in with the radical communists who also support UBI. There's no shortage of the radical communist crowd who the whole reason they like UBI is because it will strike a blow against this oppressive concept that you're supposed to have to work to make a living.
So,
yeah, but we have a pretty narrow conception of work, right? So like wage labor is like a blink of an eye in human history, about 500 years. 500 years ago, almost none of us would have been wage laborers, right? like one of us would have been a feudal lord and the others, if we were in Europe, we would have been the feudal lord and the rest of us
thinks they would be the
would be able to
It's
till.
like the opposite of the veil of ignorance.
would be tilling the land. So, like wage labor is not probably always going to be around here. And I think all of us can agree that we have fully automated luxury communism to look forward to in the distant future, not for ourselves, but for other people. So again, I think that this notion that you are going to explode the whole system by giving people $500 a month, you're going to change the system. You're going to make people less reliant on it. But I'm not sure that all of a sudden, just en masse, people are going to stop working. And in terms of this idea that people getting something for nothing is so radical. There's a political scientist who I really like at Cornell named Suzanne Mettler, and she asks people across the income spectrum, do you participate in government programs? Do you benefit from government programs? And so low income people are like, yeah, I have to go pee in a cup to get a food stamp. Like, yes, it is abundantly obvious to me that I do. High income people are almost universally like, nope, not me, don't do it. They all do, right? Except they're getting 529 college savings plan type things. They're getting home mortgage interest deduction. All of their they're getting like, $5,000 tax credits if they buy a new Prius. Like, it comes through their taxes, and they don't have to do much to get it except for have their tax person, file for it appropriately. And that's by design, right? It is by design that the programs that benefit high-income folks are easy to get and are invisible so that they almost don't even recognize it. So they're like, yes, I get public services, I get fire protection, I get public schools, but I don't get any cash, I don't get cash from the government, but they do. And so all of us, everybody is paying in, everybody is getting something out. It's just that some of us participate in that system very differently than others. And I actually don't know if at the point that people are getting Social Security, if they see that as receiving a government benefit, because I think very often, just pounded it into people's heads that you pay FICA and it goes to a magic pool and then you get that money, those specific dollars back when you turn 65, which is not how the system works. But we've really convinced people that that's how it is. And so I don't see it as so radical, except for the way that we've constructed these programs so that some people realize what they're doing and some people don't. And that's what, is all the ways in which people didn't realize that they were getting Obamacare, all of that stuff is really fascinating too.
I think this is a really good observation about wage labor as distinct from other kinds of labor. And you said something earlier about this really raises this question of what labor is. And Oren is placing a lot of value, or he claims there's all of this meaning in labor, which I think is probably right. But you're speaking about labor, or labor mediated through market exchange, right? I suspect that if you asked a homesteader who grows crops and feeds his family that way, that there would say he finds meaning in that work as well. So how much does your thinking sort of turn on the unique value of sort of market provided labor?
I don't think the wage labor distinction is especially important to the argument. I mean, in the homesteader example, if we're talking about people who are just providing for themselves, or historically the idea that everyone kind of grew their own food, that's fine too. For that matter, if we're talking about homemakers or people who are caring for relatives and so forth, I think that's important and terrific, and people can and should find a lot of meaning in that. The idea, I see the argument cutting the other way, which is because we have this, it's correct that because we have this wage labor mindset, we treat these things as differently. But it's not true that the people outside of the labor market aren't being compensated for the work they do, any more than the homesteader who grows his own crops isn't. When you raise your own child at home, the reason you don't get paid for it is because you're doing it for your own family. You are both providing the service and getting the benefit of the service. When you care for an elderly relative, you and your larger clan household, however you want to think about it, are both providing and getting the value of the service. So the reason that there's no money changing hands is because it's not changing hands in either direction. I find certainly it comes up a lot, universal basic income can support people who are doing these other things. I don't think that actually follows logically. People aren't supposed to be paid to do things that they're doing because they already get the value of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while again, this is a policy area where I think we have a fantastic discussion about what do we do for the increasing, what does it mean in economic terms if there are these increasing needs for elder care and whatever else. I think that's a great discussion to have. I don't see a universal basic income as responsive
Mm-hmm.
to it.
Yeah,
But it is, this way in which you're consuming your own production when you're doing household work, right? Like, so you can imagine like a kibbutz, right? In which you have, everybody who's obligated socially to provide labor and then consumes that labor. You can also, actually Denmark is a pretty good example of this, where women are heavily encouraged to go back into the labor force and could lose some of their benefits. There's a lot of social pressure to put your kid in daycare, and then you keep working, right? So like those are sort of two poles. And I think that the issue, one of the issues in the way that UBI addresses this is that, we know that there's this cliff. I think it's like $15 or $17. It depends on where you are because of childcare costs and minimum wage and other factors, where it's impossible for you to do anything except for take care of your own kid, right? Like unless you're making more than $15, $17 an hour, you can't actually pay for childcare. And so you have these really hard choices that people make where they would actually like to elect to go back, but they can't. And I do think that there's this funny way in which you can think about UBI as being a partial compensation for the kind of sort of invisible economic utility of care work. And it is, it's something like economists have thought about for a really long time. There was actually a decision made in the 1930s to not add a kind of household production value to GDP. But the government estimates it. And it's like trillions of dollars a year that just because it's non-compensated and there's no money changing hands. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that people don't face really hard choices about it. There's also these interesting programs in Medicaid that, especially if you say you had a child who was severely disabled, that Medicaid will actually pay you to watch your kid or another household member. So again, it's not impossible to imagine that there's a world in which that actually does happen, and that perhaps it gives people more freedom of choice, but I agree that it's like a third order question given that we're now just talking about like requiring paid leave, as most other high income countries do.
Okay, we've been chatting for about a half an hour, so I think I'd like to open it up now for Q&A. And I'll call on folks.
Right, so I wanted to respond to Oren's point about family caretaking, and it was something I was going to mention before you talked about it, because I think to play to my friends on the conservative side of the aisle in the room, I think one of the reasons why you should be interested in UBI is because it's a fundamentally pro-family policy. But it is true that people make these choices when they do make the choice to be a caretaker for family members, in part because of love, but also because it's an investment that will pay off in the future. But you can't make that investment unless you have the cash up front to do so. Yes, you understand that if you can take care of your children at home, they may make more money in the future, but that doesn't help you if you need to put food on the table today. So I'm wondering whether you see an alternative, like whether you see those benefits from having a UBI on one hand, and then on the other hand, whether you see a different policy lever that we can pull to allow people to take care of their kids or take care of elders.
Well, I guess I'd say two things. One, yes, we could have a better child credit. I mean, right? We could say, it's an advanceable child credit. Along with the birth certificate, here's a check for $5,000. For each of the next 3 years, you're going to get another $3,000. And from the age of 6 to 18, you're going to get another $1,000. I mean, there's a whole debate to be had about how best to design that and the pros and cons, but that is wildly more responsive to what you're describing, cheaper, and does not have all the drawbacks of the kind of unconditional grant. So in that sense, again, I don't think that the UBI is actually the way to do it. a little bit more broadly, I do think it's worth questioning, and this is something your conservative friends, which I'm sure you mean in the John McCain sense, I hope some of them would have the courage to say, is that it's not pro-family policy because family formation is not an economic decision in that sense. In fact, to the contrary, what is at the heart of family formation and strong, stable families is a structure of mutual obligation and caring that you are essentially forced into because the state doesn't provide it for you. And whether you're talking about, the very important need to have two parents present because, gosh, it really doesn't work if you don't, or the need to, have close relationships with a broader network of family or whatever else it is, the idea that families will be better off if we just take all the things families used to do for themselves and each other and ask and just make sure the state takes care of it, I think is exactly backward.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I actually really
She's
agree
wonderful.
with Oren's first point, which is that, man, UBI is like a blunt way to get at the child care issues that lots of other countries have solved, right? So France is a pretty good example here. They have cash payments that are linked to parental income and assets. They have public creche and preschool system. And they've really tried to move native-born birth rates up, and it's been pretty successful. And so you can argue about how much you should be providing people. I note that the Trump administration's plans for subsidies are probably pretty ill-designed because the more you spend, the more money you get. But there's lots of great ways to do this, and I think that also just on the, we can just require more of employers too, which we really require very, very little, which has negative effects as well. But I agree that UBI is not the way to go around getting people to have more kids and make it easier to raise them.
So, I guess this would maybe be taking the U sort of out of UBI, but I'm thinking one of the common criticisms of minimum wage legislation is the idea that businesses will often respond by just hiring less people, and so you have the problem showing up in a different context. Could either or both of you comment on whether you think that shifting the way you approach the problem to a system of more taxing the personal income tax and then making the spending maybe contingent on some sort of work requirement as opposed to minimum wage legislation as a meaningful or at all effective way of addressing the same problem without giving some insulation to the bad result that we would try to avoid with businesses hiring less?
Well, I'll say something. So I'll take this as my opportunity to tell you what we should do instead of universal basic income.
Finally, Oren.
Which is, we should have a generous wage subsidy. And the earned income tax credit somewhat subsidizes low-income households, but it's a really dumb way to do it for many reasons. What we should do is say, if you are earning less than, say, $15 an hour, then we are going to make up half the difference from your wage. So if you're working $9 an hour, you get $3 an hour in your paycheck. By the time you get up to $15 an hour, you don't get the subsidy anymore. If we did that, we would immediately correct to a large extent for the wage stagnation we've faced. We'd transfer a tremendous amount of money to lower income households. And actually the most interesting thing to do is to compare it to minimum wage proposals. Because when you step back and ask, in the abstract, what is a minimum wage proposal actually doing? You're saying, gosh, you're only getting $9 an hour for that job. I really wish it were 12 or 13 or 15 or whatever it is. And you know who should put that money into your paycheck? Your employer. Now there's a whole economic literature. Does the employer actually put it in at the end of the day? Does it end up just raising prices for consumers? Does it end up in lower wages to other people? I think the correct answer is no. Society should put that $3 an hour in if we actually want it there. And if you do it that way, then instead of getting the discouraging effect on employers, you're actually now making it more attractive to create more of these jobs and hire more less skilled, lower wage people. So again, for a fraction of the cost of a kind of basic income program, you can do something that's focused specifically on the people we're talking about in a way that encourages the creation of jobs for them and encourages them to take the jobs and gets more money into their paychecks at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that it's fine. I think if you're trying to think about a UBI as having two effects, right, among others, or maybe three, right? Like the better elimination of poverty by reducing holes in the safety net, like an increase of earnings to middle class folks, and then also we don't have kind of like an insurance type program as opposed to a welfare program, so protecting against economic shocks. There's other ways to do that that are more complicated but perhaps more effective. Like I'm actually kind of all for it. I think Oren's idea is a good one. The only thing I would be worried about is that you would have this effect in which employers would just move down wages and then advertise how much you're gonna get, right? Like it's actually a new car is good. Like, you know, if you go and you're buying a Prius, they're like, and you get they'll literally calculate how much you'll get back in tax benefits. And so I think that you would have to pair it with minimum wages and other requirements just to make sure that, you know, you're not just taking the money away from, I guess, you know, there's probably other ways to solve it too. So I don't think that, I think on the wage side there's a lot of ways to help things, but you know, in terms of just increasing worker power, there's a lot of other smaller board policies that I think could end up having a pretty big effect. One which is super controversial but gaining a lot of traction on the left is requiring worker representation on corporate boards, which already happens in a lot of European countries, that kind of thing. And you can do a lot through regulations without actually having to reach into the public purse.
It seems that a federal, thank you for coming, by the way. It seems that a federal job guarantee would reach both your goals, empowering workers, lifting out of poverty, and respecting the dignity of work. Why or why not is that a policy that the U.S. should pursue?
Oh man, I am, so.
See who's going to trash job guarantee more harshly.
Yeah, it's real hard. You have to come up with millions of jobs. There was a program during the Recovery Act called TANF-EF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Emergency Fund. This gave states and localities money to keep people employed, which they mostly use for wage subsidies. Hugely effective, big bang for the buck, lovely multiplier, supports private employment and non-profit employment. We know that wage subsidy programs for recently incarcerated people are really effective. They seem to be one of the only programs in public life that actually pay for themselves by reducing recidivism rates. I love this stuff, like that's great. And it doesn't require the government to come up with a bunch of work for people. But like, a job guarantee would be doing two things. It would be addressing people who are kind of like permanently having trouble attaching to the labor force, often because of issues like they're illiterate, they have drug problems, they're in very rural areas, like whatever else it might be. So you're both trying to gear jobs towards those folks, and people are always like, oh, we'll add people in preschools, and it's like, well, do you want somebody who is like recently incarcerated for violent felony in your preschool? Like you don't, you know? Like, very liberal, you know.
Was that a rhetorical question?
And then you also need jobs that will gear like way up and down for recessions, and those are really hard too. So you can imagine like a WPA type thing, but like, you know, I just think it's really like, I love the government. I'm super comfortable with really big government. Like I can't imagine them trying to hire like 25 million of us. That's my knock. It's super expensive, really tough. And so I'm a fan of like wage subsidies. I really do think if you're like very long-term unemployed, I think we should give huge wage subsidies. We should find you employment through, you know, I don't actually mind the idea of having government be employer of last resort, but I just worry with a job guarantee you get. Yeah, man, we'd all be crossing guards. Like every single traffic zebra would have a crossing guard. You know?
Do you want to file?
Do you hate it even more than I do?
I might not even hate it that much. I would just want to highlight a point that you had in there that I had not appreciated as much until recently, and that is this cyclical problem. That it's fine in the abstract to, I mean, again, as soon as you talk about the population you're trying to create jobs for, then you have to say, well, what is that set of jobs? When you try to think of a set of jobs that we could have essentially no one doing right now when there are more job openings than there are unemployed people, but also something we could have 10 million people doing, and that a government agency is going to crank up and down even over the course of a few years, I think it's just impossible to get off the blackboard into something that a government could possibly do.
Yeah, it's going to be Democrats are going to promise this, and if you look at the policies that are out there, they're very much like, let the states figure out how to do it. And it's like, oh gosh, cool.
How'd that work out with Obamacare?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty ugly, I think.
I think the version of UBI you guys have been discussing is on top of the existing welfare state. Well, there's, I guess, the libertarian friendly, and this is one you did reference, is either completely replacing the welfare state or eliminating some of it or something like that. If you do have a system that it is a full replacement or most replacement, is that still desirable on your part, or does that fix the problem that you have?
Well, I'll let you answer it first.
Yeah, so I obviously have big issues with replacing huge parts of the safety net. A lot of it works really well, like perhaps not perfectly, but people also, there's a real big cost to like taking things away and giving people new stuff. They don't like it, and like they vote, you know? And where I actually agree with the kind of like Charles Murray version of this is that a lot of our safety net programs are hard to apply for, hard to use. So there's like a bunch of famous examples of this. So SNAP, food stamps, you know, in a lot of, it's 50 state programs, right? So it's different, but in some states you can buy sweet potatoes but not white potatoes. In a lot of states you cannot buy cheese that was not produced in the United States with American milk. Like this is like the worst kind of nanny stating. There's just tremendous amounts of lobbying that go in, you know, like big American cheese is like, how dare you buy Swiss cheese, which I don't even think is often Swiss now that I say it, right? And yeah, you know, so when they were attaching work requirements, some states are now attaching work requirements to Medicaid programs, and they looked at how much this was going to cost and just like hiring people to manage. A lot of those policies are ill-designed for other reasons, but how much it was just going to cost in like hiring people to manage it, it's just a tremendous amount of money. And so I'm actually, you know, you look at a program like Social Security, it's like way less than 1% of programmatic spending goes to overhead. I'm all for it. HHS is like, you know, it's like one of the hard things about Obamacare. It's like big and a big mess, and it's super complicated. People hate applying for state Obamacare like they want Medicaid because it's like easier to use, right? And so I think that there's a real lesson in that. So I think divorcing the question of like, you know, because Charles Murray wants a much smaller government that's much more regressive and is just like doing way less in general. But like the ease of access, to like just make things automatic. You know, there's been this movement, right? Like, why isn't the EITC automatic? Why do you have to apply for it? Like stuff like that. I think that's where I agree with the argument, which is perhaps not surprising to people.
I mean, I should say I agree with the work requirement for the system. I think work requirements are generally very ill-advised, and this goes back to what I was describing, that the whole premise should be, yes, we do provide a safety net for everyone, even if you're the worst person in the world and just refuse to work. Work requirements suggest the safety net is for people who are working, which is backward. The problem with the Charles Murray type of proposal is that the math does not come anywhere close to working. I mean, what Murray does, so Murray does things like throw Social Security and Medicare into his funding pot for this. And then you just step back and you say, well, wait a minute, how much do we already spend per senior citizen on Social Security and Medicare each year? And it's like, oops, we just took away their Medicare, right? Or like, well, obviously you're still going to have Medicaid and disability programs for high-cost individuals who need a lot of help. Or even just stepping back and looking at what healthcare premiums are. What we would provide to people in a basic income is not compatible with access to the full suite of services that we provide. So you would immediately have to start piling other things back on top of it. That's both like a substantive observation of what good policy would be, and maybe even more importantly, a political economy observation that there is just no stable equilibrium of we are mailing everyone a check and don't need a safety net. And so I kind of, I think it's an interesting debating point, but I don't see it connecting a lot to the actual policy world.
I was wondering, Ms. Lowrey, if you'd be able to address how you think a UBI, I think it says here.
Yep.
How you think a UBI would impact the victims of America's criminal justice system. I'm thinking specifically if people who are either incarcerated or felons, vote, and a lot of restrictions aren't getting it, it ends up really hurting the people who are being hurt the worst by America's system right now. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, like you subsidize demand, supply is going to cost more, so people who aren't getting it are worse off than if no one was getting it.
Yeah, it's hard, and I think that this is like, there's both policy questions and political economy questions, right? Because and there's this remarkable reassessment, which I'm sure that you guys are even more knowledgeable, much more knowledgeable than I am about right now, of the ways in which the economic impact of incarceration both has tremendous effects on families, so especially the children of incarcerated people, and that has very long echoes on them. And that it's also just a barrier to getting yourself back on any kind of reasonable economic path. So you're discriminated against in hiring, in a lot of cases for very reasonable reasons. It's quite likely that you've accumulated debt while you were incarcerated, so you have to pay things like court fees, you have to pay for your own drug testing. If you need an ankle monitor, you have to pay for that, depending on like where you are and what state you're in. Often you have child support that's going to have to happen. So, I think it's gonna be a pretty tough sell to say, like, look, this is going to go to people who are incarcerated too, right? So Alaska, for instance, has an oil dividend that gets sent out to Alaskans. They do not give it to you. I believe it's if you've had a felony conviction, and you also don't get it if you're incarcerated, even for misdemeanors. So I think that that's hard. And I kind of wonder if there aren't sort of better ways to address some of those economic issues and the sort of downstream issues through policies aimed at providing employment, even guaranteed employment, to formerly incarcerated people. Again, the political economy is tough, but the Obama administration had looked at doing guaranteed employment through organizations like CEO to people who were recently released. Again, this seemed to have pretty great downstream effects, but you'd be asking American taxpayers to pay something like $50 billion. I want to say that was the number, it could have been less, like $20 or $50 billion a year to subsidize work for folks where there's still a lot of judgment. So I think that that's the kind of barrier there that is really hard to get over. When on the one hand we say, okay, like over that person's lifetime, we don't want to keep paying for them to be incarcerated. We actually want them to be like working, helping to support their family, part of society. We know that there's all of these effects on recidivism, on their health, on all of that kind of thing. But then it's also hard to see them as somebody deserving of public investment as opposed to children. So I just think it's like that's the really tough thing. But a lot of the work that's going on about that, there's a big Department of Labor study that's supposed to be coming out. It was actually supposed to have already come out, but it's supposed to be coming out on those kind of on those reentry programs. Anyway, I hope that answered your question.
I think the gentleman in the blue shirt.
I want to explore the guaranteed income as well as the wage subsidy, because they kind of seem similar on its face. It seems to me that it would disincentivize mobility either in your current employment or to other industries where you could get better pay, thus limiting economic production. Could y'all kind of address that, whether you think it would?
I'll say something about that. I mean, I think the key thing about a wage subsidy that looks, as I described it, that looks different from even the earned income tax credit and certainly other anti-poverty programs, is that it doesn't necessarily phase out as you earn more money. It only phases out when you get a raise. And so what I mean by that is that if you're working $10 an hour and that gets some subsidy, and you take more hours, and then your wife takes hours, as much as you want to work, the subsidy is just based on the hours worked. In almost any other program that we have, as soon as your income starts to look higher, we start taking benefits away from you, which is really discouraging in a lot of cases, and actually ends up having, for supply-siders especially, low-income households end up facing the highest marginal tax rates, which is insane. The nice thing about a wage subsidy is that it doesn't phase out on work, it only phases out on raises. And so you're right that all things equal, it would be nice if we didn't penalize people for getting promotions and raises or moving to higher paid industries. The reality is that unless we are going to have a universal system, you have to phase out somewhere. And so ideally you want to phase out on something that people like instead of something that people don't like. And so that's certainly a not ideal component that, well, at the margin, then I'm less encouraged to move to that higher paid job, or employers are more likely to give me some kind of in-kind benefit instead of a raise. That's true. At the end of the day, people want raises and better jobs and to be paid more for the same hours of work. And so of all the available systems, I think it's probably the best one.
Yeah, mean, I agree with Oren. This is like a policy challenge, but it's a really common one. And it's one that administration after administration after administration chooses, and Congress after Congress and Congress chooses not to solve. There are definitely ways to graduate payments and subsidies such that you're never facing these kinks where it doesn't make sense to work more. It's just, you have to pay attention to it, and it's one of these places where the US is just really bad about doing that. It's like, again, it's like tricky, and oftentimes you have these like, the programs aren't talking to each other, but it's like, man, it's just one of these places where policy design can be pretty good so that you never want people to like look at jobs and say, okay, would it be better to receive this or that because I need to calculate my taxes and figure out on the other end. And we know that people don't do that either. But we do know that when they're like, oh man, if I start earning, $2 more per hour, I'm gonna lose this benefit. Like, we know that they make that rational choice. Anyway.
I think we have time for one, maybe two.
Depends if it's a good question.
Yeah. It's a bad question, we're just gonna go right there.
It felt to me a bit like Oren was talking about this kind of big income, grand, sweeping social change, and Annie was talking a little bit more about something that would lift the working poor out of poverty, soften up the lives of retirees, stay-at-home moms. So I guess for Oren, what do you think of a much more limited UBI that just does that? And for Annie, with $2 trillion, if you could put half of that in a wage subsidy and then use the other half to do like free community college, apprenticeships, and some other stuff, why wouldn't that be better?
So I think a more limited program is a great idea. We should be clear that it's not a UBI. It's neither universal nor a meaningful basic income at that point. So per the resolution stated. But I think that's when it, beyond being pedantic about it, I think that's actually a really important thing to establish, is that the big grand UBI is not a good idea. And once we can agree on that, then great, let's talk about what the right formulation, who are the groups we're trying to help, what's the right way to do it. And we could talk for days about all the different policy reforms we support and don't support, and for all the different reasons. But there's a surprising amount of UBI momentum out there right now, and I think it's important to start from the principle that no, that is not either feasible or desirable.
Yeah. UBI is like something people like talking about, and it's a really easy way to back in to talking about all these like super gnarly policy changes that are really important. But like, so there was this debate in the Trump tax bill where Mike Lee and Marco Rubio almost got this really big expansion of the child tax credit with full refundability through, and then they didn't at the last minute, and they won't say why. They didn't just insist. And like, that's like, it works under the principles, right? But it's like not, you don't like sell books and fill rooms to talk about like those little changes, but they're really important. And I think both Oren and I are like policy people that like getting down into this really granular detail stuff. And that's like actually why I like UBI, is like people just like talking about it and thinking about it, and the kind of radicalism draws people in and then like lets them see like, oh, there's a bunch of really reasonable policy changes that we can make that don't like blow the whole system up and require taxes to go to like 100% on rich people and all that good stuff. So yeah, I mean, if I had $2 trillion to play with, like, I don't think I'd do a UBI. Like, I think that, I think that guaranteeing an income, so ending poverty, is something that we never talk about. Bernie Sanders didn't have an end poverty plan, and he was promising like the moon, right? And he's not like, we should end child poverty. Like, we should end child poverty. Like, we should just do that. And it doesn't even cost that much money. It costs like nothing compared to UBI. And so, I also, one of the things that we haven't talked about that I think is an issue with the UBI is if we keep on squeezing out non-defense discretionary spending, so investment spending on things like education, scientific research, right? Like, this is kind of one of these perpetual problems we talk about, and I do worry about this world in which you have a government that just is redistributive and is not investing in other ways. I worry about that less if you're investing money in kids, but it's like, I don't know, it's like Paul Krugman's line that the government is like an insurance company with an army. Like, but like, I worry about that. And I just think this kind of, the multiplier, like the bang for the buck, the best dollar that we can spend, I think that the amount of poverty that we tolerate is a moral blight. I think poverty among non-disabled, childless adults is disgusting. I think poverty among children is like infuriating and ridiculous. So that's the stuff that like I care about most. And I think that, you know, the policy changes that you would need to eliminate it are really small. But it's like, yeah, if you had $2 trillion, and there's just a lot of room in the budget to do things better than the way that we do them. There's really no end to changes that I think would be good to make.
Okay, we have 2 minutes, so
It was a good question.
Yeah, it's a
I
great
know,
question.
I'm kind of tempted to end on that, but I don't want to cheat anybody out of questions. So at the very back, did you have? Okay.
I had a question about the idea of the UBI disincentivizing work. It seems like it would definitely increase, you know, the fallback price or the threat position of workers, but if there weren't jobs that were offering them, you know, either enough wages or a good enough job that they would take, isn't that a problem with the job offering and not the problem on the person not taking that job?
I guess what I would say about that is that what determines whether or not people work and how much they work is a lot more complex than sort of what's the hourly wage offered in front of me at this moment. I mean, one of the big problems, I think is pretty much bipartisan agreement that we have at this point is declining labor force participation, particularly for prime age males and young men. And, you know, one thing about low wage jobs and minimum wage jobs, very few people stay in them indefinitely. For very many people, they are a first job. And so I think you have to take not a point in time snapshot. If you ask me like what would be best for everyone tomorrow, and we had $2 trillion, I'd say, well, we should probably mail everyone a check for their share of the $2 trillion. As a static policy, that makes a tremendous amount of sense. If you're talking about a dynamic policy, and again, recognizing from a behavioral economics perspective that your typical person is not making rational NP, you know, net present value calculations about their lifetime when they decide whether they really want to go take a crappy job when they're 19 years old. What you, having a labor market and a society that forces people into certain decisions in a sense, I think is actually a very good, important thing. And, it sort of gets into sort of social conservatism in a very broad sense. But the sort of structural institutions that we have that put people on certain tracks in life are actually a very beneficial, important thing. And so when I talk about kind of radical change of a policy reform, that's the kind of thing that I worry about, is saying, well, more choice is good, more freedom is good. I don't think that's actually always the case.
We'll give Annie the last word if you have.
Yeah, but my takeaway is that you don't like choice and freedom.
Generally speaking.
Yeah. I agree. There's this really great study of older folks who, when they stop describing themselves as unemployed, they start describing themselves as retired. They get happier. So much so that they have less cortisol in their blood. And I really take that seriously when people talk about like blowing the whole system of labor up, right? When you ask people what they want, which I don't think we do enough in public policy, they want to work. They want like good jobs where if you're a single parent, you could possibly send 2 kids to college. Like that's what they want. And I do think that there's lots of ways that we could help get there. And I think it's like clear that there's a real societal concern that we're just not doing enough. Which I guess brings it back to the issues we talked about at the beginning. And anyway, so I'll leave it there.
Circle. All right, let's thank our speakers. Thank you very much.